Welcome back. It's been a pretty long while. Today we're going to be making the case for Deicide's Legion as the greatest death metal album of all time. Maccauley from Predation and Giga is back. And let's get into it. Come on, give us background on Legion, everything that happened up to it.
Happened up to it. All right. Well, we're going to begin with Amen then. So before they were Deicide, they were called Amen, which was their pronunciation. I mean, they didn't call it a Mun or anything like that. But I think they began. Yeah. Well, actually, they began as a band named Carnage in 1987, and then became Amen. And they were that for a little while, and they actually released a collection of demos later. Obviously, everybody knows Amen Feasting the Beast, which practically has every single song from the first Deicide album, except for a couple. But yeah, they began life as this just very prototypical death metal band. But it was at that time where you had bands like, early Morbid Angel, Necrovore, and I'm blanking on a whole bunch of other bands, possibly even like Sarcophago and stuff like that, where you had this kind of like blending of both black metal and death metal, in the sense that it was kind of first wave black metal melding with death metal, where you had the vicious death metal music, but all of the lyricism and all of the atmosphere was clearly influenced by a lot of black metal, like early black metal at that time period.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was Glen Benton's, no, it was the Hoffman brothers saying that their main objective at the time was to be, even more aggressive than Sodom's first release, Obsessed by Cruelty.
Oh my God, that was such it was between Sodom and Destruction and Hell Awaits. I want to say those are huge influences on what Deicide was going to do. And it was mainly Brian who had those types of influences. Eric, from what I've understood, is more of kind of like a shredder, Yngwie Malmsteen type. But he ended up learning the type of stuff that Brian was doing, and took hold of the death metal thing and kind of combined it with his own virtuosity at the time. And they and especially in early interviews, they really described it as like a black attack, like it almost this kind of like nihilistic Satanism type of attack in music. And obviously with the song title of Deicide and with the name Deicide, their catchphrase would eventually become "to kill God and all that is holy," which is a fucking sick catchphrase.
Yeah. So, once we get to the first full length, the self-titled one, it's really apparent at this point that they're full on death metal.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, the thing is they never. It wasn't as if they were like teetering on becoming black metal or anything like that. It was that kind of like weird, and you can hear it with Necrovore and a lot of the bands from that, like the I want to say like the mid to late '80s death metal, where it definitely had that influence. Everybody was talking about Satan and hell and demons and damnation. And so you get that from early Slayer and Merciful Fate, which were obviously massive influences. And, they were considered even like first wave black metal and death metal at that time. But by the time you did get the Deicide album, when they had to become Deicide because Roadrunner Records told them like, hey, and I've never understood this reasoning, but they're like, hey, King Diamond has a song with Amen in the title. So it's not to confuse anybody, because we think people are fucking stupid. Let's have you change, your band name to this new Deicide song, which they did. I'm fine either way. I love Deicide, I love Amen, but you have, even just looking at just the simplicity of the album cover of Deicide with the emblem that was Glen's at that time, you can see the album itself and everything that goes into it is as simple and succinct and vitriolic as that album cover. It's like a what you see is what you get. It's just a battering ram from the very beginning of the album. and it definitely combines, you know, all of that early Slayer, Sodom, Destruction. I don't know if they were necessarily influenced by Creator, but definitely a lot of those bands into an even more bestial demonic attack.
Yeah, this is where you really see that they're starting to experiment, with the more rhythmic approach. They really perfected on Legion, Dead by Dawn, Glen's introduced into the entire extreme metal lexicon, the kind of pan two high vocals and two low vocals attack. And we're really at this point where it's very different to that kind of death thrash black soup of bands like Sarcophago. Everything was very not quite codified. Here, this is full on death metal. Things are precise. We're starting to get very good, good solos. Seems that Slayer's the kind of guiding influence in here.
You could literally look at this band as an evolution of Slayer. It's the same type of lineup. You have a bass player, vocalist. You have two lead guitar players, one blonde, one brunette, and then you have this kick-ass fucking drummer in the back. And it's literally like you took Slayer and it was just moved it that much forward, but you cut out a lot of the bullshit that Slayer was doing on Rain and Blood and South of Heaven, and you bumped up the BPMs, and you even made the intense solos of Slayer that much more intense. I mean, these dudes were not thinking about, oh, was I in key there? They're thinking about, how can I make this have as much atmosphere as Going to Hell would sound like?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. This is like an alternative evolution of that Slay had after Hell Awaits. Like,
Oh,
even
it's not awaiting anymore. This is hell.
yeah,
This is it's like you're at the bottom pit of hell, or at least you're reaching there. I mean, you have every single one of these songs. That's the thing about this album. This album is one of those albums where there is no filler. Every single one of these songs, and including Day of Darkness, which I know a lot of people don't like, every single one of these songs is just a classic. It's just, this is a must listen to for a reason, but it's one of those albums that you can continually listen to, and it doesn't become like the Cannibal Corpses or the Deaths, or even the Obituaries to an extent. This album appreciates on repeated listens, which I know a lot of people don't think, because it is insanely popular.
Yeah, I definitely do believe it is the kind of a limit that style could allow them to really explore. And then from there to Legion, there's this incredible boost in technique, production, performance, composition, everything. It's like if it's a band went through a factory that transformed them into infinitely better musicians.
Which and I've discussed this with so many other people, the crazy thing about Legion, and I think a friend of mine described this the best way, was this album was made by people who, without being a trained musician or knowing any type of theoretical background or anything like that, this is almost like the nth degree as you could go being a death metal musician. I know there's a lot of people that talk about a lot of technical death metal and bullshit like that now, where it's basically video game music bumped up a whole bunch, but this is really taking that idea of the unsophisticated death metal caveman and just amplifying it to a degree that I don't think anybody else is. I mean, and we've talked about so many albums already that we've said the same thing, but nobody else has recreated Legion. No one else has even really tried recreating it, because I don't think it can be. Deicide couldn't even do it. And the thing is, the crazy thing about Legion for Deicide was alienating. When people heard this album, and I can even pull up interviews with people from Monstrosity who were saying, like, oh my god, like, I love the first Deicide album, but the new album is just almost like too much. It's almost too much for people to handle.
Yeah, definitely, everything really was really pushed to the limit. And I think this is where Deicide found their own particularities is their combination of both melody, so they've got dissonant, chromatic, even some consonant parts, and rhythm. I think rhythm is such an understated aspect of this record.
Oh, and it was almost as if this was Florida's answer to a lot of the stuff that was occurring percussively in New York, where these guys, Deicide were originally from New York, like a lot of Florida death metal bands like Malevolent Creation and even Shock. These were guys that came to Florida because, it's cheaper to live down there and it's not freezing cold. But it was as if, it was these guys' turn to be like, all right, this is our salvo of absolutely crazy syncopated type riffing. And there's some really almost wacky, strange type of rhythms on this album that another band attempting it would sound like a joke. But these guys, they pulled it off, and it's very strange. I mean, there's some really weird kind of almost bouncy type of riffs, but it's not bouncy in the thrash metal way. It's just very strange.
Yeah, I mean, let's try to define like what's the kind of stereotypical Legion rhythm.
It's I would say off kilter. That's the best way I could describe it. Is just it's not going to be exactly normal. You could take a simple song off this album, which the simplest song on this album is what is that? I
Dead
think
but
track
dreaming.
no, no. The simplest song on this album is Holy Deception.
Yeah.
I know where you're going with Dead But Dreaming. That's the one that they actually perform live the most today. But Dead But Dreaming's also a weird fucking song. Like it's got, some pretty intense stuff. I mean, and I used to not really like that song, but I've really come to this is the album where I said Deicide appreciates. This really matures over time. I mean, this almost defies the idea of that principle of depreciation over time. This is the album that really appreciates over time. And it takes a long time to reach the maturation where you can finally hear it and be like you get it. And it does take a long time because I mean, I would listen to it when I was very young, like 15, 16, and I'm just like, I don't really understand what they're doing. Like the first album is catchy. The first album is almost like pop songs. But this they threw that out the door and they're like, let's make as, demonic a vision from inside of them as they possibly could. And I think they even had to step back and be like, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if we can do this again or even keep up with this intensity. But I would say the simplest track is Holy Deception, track 6, because that's actually the first track written for the album. It was actually very close, I imagine, to being on the first Deicide album.
I have a little example for the good example of their crazy rhythms. The climatic part in Satan Spawn, the Caco Demon.
It's almost hard to find words to say about that particular, like any kind of part on this, because I think that was another thing that a lot of people attribute to this album and albums that, you know, have this kind of nature, not necessarily the same nature, but, it's a very muscular pick attack. It's a very concentrated series of just these guys weren't following a technique. They were just wanting to play as physical as they wanted to. It was a very it was almost like you were trying to torture your own guitar.
Yeah, literally, I mean, everything's done at such a high pace. So it's really hard to kind of discern the rhythm, at first listens. And there's always these very small micro variations, you know, it's very hard to kind of pinpoint, because they seem like always on the offbeat. It's very counterintuitive.
And the funny thing is ironically they don't even know the term offbeat. They
Yeah.
just know that they're playing it in a very strange fashion. They wanted to play almost, if I could say, like asymmetrical, or definitely not normal. And I think another thing is they close the gap on a lot of the subdivisions of the notes, and they cram a lot of notes into just a single measure, and it makes it very hard to get completely right on the right hand. I mean, this album is to play this album, which is like 28 minutes of just, you probably end up having like arthritis or carpal tunnel by the end of
Yeah, that's one thing that makes it even more screwed up, is that they always figure out a way to, to stick within 4/4, because I don't think these guys knew that you could do stuff in 5/4, 7/8, or whatever. So, they have that kind of main rhythmic idea, and then they just try to cram as many notes, to fill in those spaces.
Definitely. I mean, they are still kind of like following Steve, where it's just like, one, like it's a fast 4/4, but it's like 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, but they're just like, blitzing on the low E string and just, fitting as much into it. And you're right, they're not really necessarily doing like a 6/8, like 1 2 3 1 2 3 or anything like that. Although, in order to actually probably count out a lot of the riffs on this album, you would have to put a lot of things in odd time signatures, because they probably did things. I mean, they're not thinking about like, oh, what is that in? They're just, playing it exactly the way that they feel. And that's exactly the key to this album, is feel. They were feeling each one of these riffs, and whoever wrote them, because that's obviously been highly disputed over the years. But it is just about the feeling of the player and exactly what they're trying to get across. It's not trying to be, this was stuff written for the song, even though it was highly technical.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about Steve Assayam's drumming here, because it's very hyperactive, but it really is the anchor that, keeps everything in place.
I would say, and this can also be said for Slayer in a lot of aspects. I would say that Steve is probably the most accomplished musician in the band, and then following them, the guitar players, obviously. But I do think that he had a very strict regimen of time to keep to the chaos, to bring order to a lot of the chaos that's going on.
Yeah, honestly, I'm convinced he was playing to a click or something, or maybe they evened out the beats, during post production. But it's very tight. He definitely knew to an extent what he was doing.
I did, at that time, I mean, I'm pretty sure, I don't think that Morrisound was using a click to record any of these albums. I know for sure that they didn't for Cannibal Corpse until, say around The Bleeding. So this was 92. So I highly doubt Steve did. I think he's just that good. He's just so precise because the guy puts in the work. That's the main thing, is he puts in all of the work. He was the progenitor a lot of the blast beat techniques and a lot of the death metal techniques, of really adding power to each of the hits and keeping it as accurate as it needs to be. So I just really think he's just an accomplished musician. And I've heard that he even possibly wrote some of the material on this album.
Yeah, not surprising considering how much of the later stuff he did end up writing. In
Oh,
spite of
he's the primary songwriter now, but you can clearly tell there's a difference between the material now and the material then. So anybody wondering if the Hoffman brothers had any sort of input, there's your answer.
Yeah. All right. So, now we did the rhythm. Let's talk about, the melodies, because, this album is extremely melodic, not in a Gothenburg, very saccharine kind of melody, but it's memorable. It's not rhythm for the sake of rhythm, which is some really good bands like Baphomet tend to fall into. No, everything, every note is chosen with a purpose here.
Yeah, and again, I think this would probably be more of your area because it's hard for me to pinpoint particular melodies in these songs because I do think it is incredibly rhythmical. But the more that if you took the rhythms out, there's clearly an underlying set of notes that does go from somewhere. It's not just entirely like just the low E string for the sake of it. Um, I know exactly the one that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I know specifically that one in particular, I found a very old interview. I know for a fact this song is one of the Hoffman brothers.
Yeah, I mean, just that kind of melodic development is not something that, I would ever expect from a band, like Deicide.
No, it does come out of left field for them because you're thinking like, they're the masters of doing this type of, very inchoate type of sound involving like some of the lower frets. And then you have this almost, you can hear kind of like especially that early Slayer influence, but taken like just bumped up way higher BPM and way higher in the technique to where it sounds, unlike anything else that anybody was doing at that time. And the funny thing about this particular song, Repent to Die, this was the one song that I know that they never performed live until this year when they did that 30th anniversary. So this was the one that they never did because I imagine it was just too technical.
Yeah, definitely. And, I want to mention, the very subtle harmonization between the Hoffman brothers. They're not exactly playing the same thing, especially on the higher parts of the guitar.
Oh no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's the thing about this album is that the guitar tracks are very loud but very clear. Same thing with the bass, which can't be said on any other Deicide album. This is the only album where you can hear every instrument very articulately and cleanly. I don't know and that was the other weird aspect about this album is the fact that this is the only album in E standard. I don't know if that had a huge thing to do with it, but I know that this album doesn't sound like any of the other albums. It does kind of sound like the first album, but it's very in and of itself, the way that this album sounds and feels.
Yes, definitely. And the band do know when to hold back that rhythmic insanity, to really push ahead how good their fucking melodies can be.
And that's the thing that I wish that they did more often was have more melody like that. But it almost the thing that feels bad, and not that there's anything bad in this album to me, but it almost felt like that little sense of melody almost felt like an ornamentation and not an actual color that's involved in the canvas of the album.
So I can understand, considering how, rhythm is the determining factor, to how good this album is.
Oh yeah, I mean, you don't hear a lot of things that's going on in the middle part of the guitar neck where they're doing those types of that type of playing. They're either doing a lot of stuff down here where it's very articulate, or they're doing these crazy chaotic solos involving the tremolo.
I have another riff. This is probably the simplest riff on the entire album. You see, that's one of the rare parts where they don't have that kind of a syncopated stomping pattern, where it's just a very simple tremolo picked riff.
And it's definitely those types of riffs. That's the what is the word? I think you guys the parlance that you guys used earlier was a mocking type riff. Nah, 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 that type of thing that's going on. That's exactly what that type of riff is. It's all chromatic, and it's a lot of like passing tones, but it's done to give it a sinister, evil, and for lack of a better word, mischievous type of tone.
Yeah, it has a kind of reverse suffocation feel because I was trying to play this, and the beginning starts off kind of like the harmonic minor scale, mysterious but still melodic before going fully chromatic.
Yeah. I'm trying, and you're talking specifically about the riff in Trifiction, right?
Yeah, the tremolo picked riff.
58 seconds. Okay. So musically, there's so many bands that do this. I do this. I imagine you probably do this.
Of course,
when
everyone.
composing music. What's going on is it's going down by what I would call major and minor dyads. So just grabbing my guitar quickly, and this is just on like a clean channel. So it's not exactly that, but that might actually be it. But
yeah, so pretty similar.
So what that is it's going down by this would be like a fourth. So this is like a major third dyad, and it's including the fourth of each of those as well, which is a total Slayer thing, but it's so many other bands things that this is part of the vocabulary of everybody that plays death metal. I mean, you could do it. I mean, there's so much that you can do with it if you're creative enough. But musically, it's just a pattern that can be easily repeated, and you're just simply playing something. Like you said, it is a very simple type of riff, but it's effective, especially with the guitar tone that they achieved on this album. It's just this bulldozer of a fucking tone that you could play anything with it and it would sound heavy.
Oh yes, definitely. Let's talk about the tuning. How is this album so heavy yet in E standard?
Strictly by pure strength of will and spite. Like, they did this. I don't know if they did it purposely. Everything else they've ever done is in E flat, and I think one album is actually in D standard. But yeah, this album, I think that it's just how vicious they were playing with their right hands on it. This is I'm if I'm not mistaken, I think Glen either had started using a pick or he may have used a pick on the first album, but definitely on this album he used a pick if he played the bass on this, because there's rumors that one of the Hoffman brothers play, or both of them played the bass for this album. But it's definitely it's more about it proves that you don't have to be in a super low tuning to be heavy. Now, are you going to be able to get away with a lot of the things that a low tuning can do by just holding out a big chord and playing it and it being heavy? No, but these guys, they chose, a different path that they forged for themselves, where it, just every riff was just going to be like every muscle in your body is tightened up. It's not, they're not relenting. That's the whole thing about this album. It's absolutely unrelenting.
Oh yes, definitely. I think in one of there's a lot of dissonance in this album, but they use their dissonance in a way that doesn't feel meme like. Like a lot of modern death metal bands, especially after Gorguts Obscura came out, have been, using dissonance for the sake of dissonance.
Well, I think that a lot of the problem is that a lot of people ended up becoming learned musicians, and they used dissonance in the way that, if somebody was coming up with an example of dissonance, it's very clinical and sterile, lifeless, and just there's no creativity to it. These guys, I mean, again, they probably didn't know what the word dissonance meant. They just knew how it felt to play certain notes next to one another and what that would feel like for them, the audience, or whoever. It was something that it 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 was fulfilling for them to be able to play.
Um, on Dead But Dreaming, the song starts out the weirdest way. It feels like this kind of half riff, like in length, right? Very short. That leads to this incredibly simple and catchy, main riff, but that is just so effective.
One of the things in this song that really, and a lot of the other songs, is the little tiny pause that would be in a section of the riff that would make it, again, like I kind of said before, off kilter, where it would be like, oh, I wouldn't think to pause there, but where it's like, they have all these like kind of small rests, almost like micro rests in it that make it inimitable.
It's definitely, I mean, just this kind of very basic main riff, which is fantastic. How even a child can hum it in their head, and
Oh
yet
yeah.
it still has so much power.
And that is something that they took with them from the first album, which was to it's almost like this album is almost paradoxical. They took the catchiness of the first album but blended it with um this kind of like technical entry point needed in order to truly understand this album. And it's just um it's like this black hole of a release that
Yeah,
again, you can look at the album cover, which is just this, kind of blastogram or whatever it is that they called it, and it's almost through like a fisheye lens. It's very, very strange. Like wondering why they made the decision to do that, but it's almost like you are entering into that kind of center part of the album cover and staying there. That's a way to end a song right there.
I mean,
Just that particular riff starting at 251 that you're talking about, that's definitely like a black metal section where
yeah,
it almost just sounds like fire coming through the speakers. It's just, you don't know what's being played, but you just know that it's just tearing your head off. And it goes into this solo that's, a Deicide solo, but they do something really cool where they have that repeating dive bomb loop until the end of the track, which is just so eerie sounding.
I know, and this kind of very fast, constantly, changing tremolo picked riff. It became the staple for technical death metal bands a decade after, where, it's all tremolo picked, but you're not playing the note. Maybe the first note you'll play it 4 times, the second one 3 times and such. This kind of insanity that cryptopsy really popularized. Like they use it, and instead of making it sound kind of video game-ish, they really, take it to its almost black metal levels of ferocity.
And that's where it should be. It shouldn't be this kind of. I think another staple of the technical death metal thing that they're doing the inverse of, like the good of, is the single note, not the tremolo, but just multiple notes in a row, like that part in Repent to Die, or like other parts where it's that type of thing. They're not doing it in a melodic fashion where you just hear it almost just be like a scalar type thing, but they're doing it in a way that serves the song rather than entirely serves themselves. One of my particular favorite songs on the album, I think, would be just the entirety, but specifically like just the beginning of Behead the Prophet, No Lord Shall Live. I mean, the way that one comes on, you can tell with just like the one guitar. Like this is, if you were in like the mosh pit, which you can see at the time, they used to do this funny thing where Glen would actually throw like a mannequin or something in the audience during that particular song. And they'd say Behead the Prophet, and everybody else would scream No Lord Shall Live. And this is just one that's I've moshed in a car before to this particular song. I love this song. So I think, if you wanted to check that out, I mean, the
Yeah, let's
beginning
do
of
it.
you kind of have riff A, which begins the song, where the classic thing of like one guitar introduces it, then everybody comes in. And you're having like a high speed drum beat during this section, but then on the next variation you almost have like a halftime groove that he's doing there. But the Hoffmans on the flip side of that decide to add more notes into it. And then finally, when the vocals kick in, the cool thing about them is that Glen is syncopating the lyrics for the most part to the actual riff of the song, which that's the only way foreseeably that you could actually do lyrics over a part like this. It's so, syncopated and idiosyncratic.
Yeah, completely agree. The drums kind of almost feels like they're slowing down, maybe not hitting the cymbals as much, or the snare, and but the guitars literally add in that signature Legion stomp.
Yeah, where you're fitting in as many notes as possible into, say, a triplet or a quadruplet even. And you mentioned something pretty interesting, where it almost feels like the drums are slowing down. One of the more famous or infamous examples of this is what is the first track on Incantations Onward to Golgotha? Is that Golgotha?
Yeah, it's Golgotha. Yeah.
Okay, so you know how that starts out where there's like a fast drum beat for just like a couple seconds, and then it goes into like a slower drum beat. It's a very jarring feeling because you're expecting like, oh, they're doing, but then they don't. And they do that faster bit for just a very few couple seconds. The same thing here, where they're doing the first four measures, they do the faster bit, but then they go to the slower, where the guitars are doing more and the drums are doing less. So it's like they're both synced into the beginning, and then the instruments go to their extremes in the next riff.
All right. Well, considering how much of a mindfuck this is vocally, I mean, we have to admit one thing. Glen Benton is pretty much rapping on some of these parts.
Practically, yeah. I mean, you could make that argument for a lot of a lot of death metal musicians at this time. And unfortunately, with fucking terrible bands like Archspire, you do actually have rapping now in death metal. But yeah, I mean, in order to fit all of the lyrics, which, that was, I think, the one thing from Glen that he was able to provide was these lyrics and the way that he did them, the way that he did his signature growl, which this is probably his finest hour. Both, if he did anything with the bass musically, but also lyrically, and how he fit the lyrics over the actual music itself.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? The Archspire comparisons actually go much further than just the rapping, or what can be perceived as being rapping. Archspire did take a lot of this kind of the insanity. Whether it's the technical riffs, whether it's the kind of asymmetrical rhythms, or the all over the place kind of tremolo picked riffs. Like, Legion's language completely exists within modern technical death metal in every
Well,
single way.
it was like you were saying a second ago. All right, you can see a trajectory. We were talking about Deicide, but then you mentioned Cryptopsy. And Cryptopsy took it and they almost kind of did like this weird classical music type thing combination with the death metal. All right, well, Archspire began their life as a band called Defenestration.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, they probably wouldn't cop to it today because I actually know some of, like, I don't know them personally, but I know of some of the musicians in that band, and they don't know thing one about death metal, but clearly somebody did in the early days, and you can see. I mean, being Canadian, Cryptopsy is obviously one of the biggest bands in Canada, but nobody wants to really copy their early works, which is the only thing worth copying when it comes to Cryptopsy. But you can see a trajectory there. But clearly, a lot of modern bands, so as to make money, lost the plot.
Yeah, it's funny. I never understood why, in all of these technical old school technical death metal lists, Legion is never mentioned.
Oh no, not at all. And which is a travesty in and of itself. But I don't think that a lot of people consider this album a technical death metal album because it doesn't have the trappings and stereotypical parts of a technical death metal album. It kind of transcends those qualities, and the other thing that's the issue is the issue with Deicide itself and what Deicide became. The unfortunate thing is now when you think of Deicide, you just think of this cranky old man pissed off at God and writing literally song titles like Mad at God or Fuck Your God or shit like that. I mean, it became just like a walking fucking stereotype. And I absolutely resent that when 30 years ago they were this band that had integrity and also something to offer.
Yeah, it's insane to think what this band became. Probably, the worst fall from grace for any death metal band. Any classic death metal band. When you hear nowadays, the songs are literally da 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 da.
Well, they do that. They've kind of done this thing, which a lot of with the older bands, they kind of do this thing where they fall into just like the same trappings, which is they try to incorporate another genre or they fall back on being a speed metal band, which I've never understood. A lot of bands start to bring in melody, but it's that cheesy saccharine type of melody from Sweden or US heavy metal bands, which I love those US heavy metal bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, but it has no place to me in Deicide. And I remember when the latest album came out and Steve was saying like, oh yeah, there's one riff in there that's total Judas Priest, and I'm thinking, you're not writing particularly because you even want to write. You're writing in a way that makes it easier for you to write. And it's just like, oh, this part sounds like Judas Priest, or this part sounds like whatever the hell else they were being influenced by at that moment.
You, I think this album's legacy has been completely destroyed by what Deicide became later on in life.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It should almost be two different bands.
I mean, it's very funny because this is one of the rare situation where a band's future actually destroys its past.
Completely. I mean, I would go so far as to say, um, I would go so far as to say is this is the last great album.
Yeah, I do think they have a few good songs here and there. If you took maybe the next 2 or 3 albums and condensed them, you could probably get a decent EP out of it. Nothing much, though.
The thing that I kind of hated was I found out that with Once Upon the Cross, apparently the album was too short and they made them play it slower to make the album longer. So I would have loved to have heard, I would have loved to have heard a very short, like almost like an EP. It was supposed to be something like maybe, I don't know, like 26 minutes, shorter than Legion. I would have loved to have heard of like a more vicious Once Upon the Cross, but by that time, by 95, 3 years have gone by, and these guys are going up and up and up the ladder, where this is the tippy top for Roadrunner bands is 95. They by the time that they made it to Serpents of the Light, I've tried getting into Serpents of the Light, but I really don't like it. That's more like they took actual influence from second wave black metal bands and they did it in the wrong way. It's just not for me. And then anything after that is fucking garbage.
All right. We need to talk about one final thing.
Sure.
I think, in a kind of funny yet epic way, the most memorable part of this album is the Revocate the Agitator part.
I mean, it's really on that line, it's teetering on that line between just genius and retardation.
I know. What a way to end an album, though. Like, that part I will never forget in my life. I mean, one thing I love about Glen Benton's lyrics, he invents words. Like, he does not care.
Yeah.
It's revoke. I don't know what Revoke the Agitator is, who the Agitator is. Maybe he's referring to Christ and his disciples, agitating the kind of masses in the Roman Empire to bring them to, Christianity.
I have absolutely no idea what it could possibly mean.
Yeah, but I know it sounds insane, and I really miss this part of like Glen Benton's lyricism that mixes a certain amount of genius, like and retardation, like you said, and just weird nonsensical probably brain damage.
Well, also too, he just cared. He cared about what he was writing. Now it's formulaic. Now it's almost like, oh, can we expect Glen to be pissed off at God again?
Yeah.
And you would almost look forward to like the 1 or 2 songs on like a future Deicide album that had nothing to do with blasphemy or anti-Christianity.
Yes, definitely. So, I always thought, this part here in Revocate the Agitator, it's the most Deicide Legion-esque thing ever on this album. It's borderline ridiculous.
Yeah, that's basically how you could describe this album, as borderline ridiculous.
I mean, especially the high voice, Revocate the Agitator. You can tell at this point he's tired.
You can quickly go too far with that. You can, you have to do it because he's not doing it in a subtle fashion, but it's like if you overdid that, this album would sound terrible.
Yeah.
If you just kept doing high parts.
Definitely, well, I think this kind of leads us to our end. There is no doubt, there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that this is a top tier death metal album, will always will be. easily a number one of all time for, anyone who thinks that way. It just, at the end of it, it comes to slight preferences, but it is one of the greatest metal albums of all time.
Oh yeah, and the cool thing about it is this is probably one of the most popular uh like best death metal albums of all time. It's definitely sold a lot of copies and gotten into a lot of people's hands, but unfortunately, nobody um nobody did anything with it.
Yeah, it's a complete and absolute shame.
I mean, can you think of any band that comes close to aping the sound?
Ooh, you know what? I think the those elements do appear, like we said, in technical death metal, but I think the direct pipeline, the only one I can think of is the Polish early, like, death metal. Well, they're always kind of techy, Vader and Decapitated, but there was a lot of
Yeah,
Morbid Angel in there as well. I think
I
that's
would definitely say, especially in Vader's case, you can look at if you've ever seen the Sothis EP.
yes,
That's literally just copying the artwork from the first album. I mean, it looks exactly like it to me.
yeah.
So it definitely, you can see the trajectory in it. Unfortunately, with the Polish death metal stuff, um, I love my favorite Vader album is De Profundis, but I hate the vocals, which are not even really this growl, but this kind of like awful shout or yell.
It's Tom Araya but deeper. That's the
Yeah.
impression I get.
And I've never been a fan of that. I like, either super low type of growls or what Glen is doing here, where he's got a lot of power behind it.
Mm.
That was another thing. That was another funny thing about this album was I don't know if you've ever seen in the booklet, but it says like there were no vocal processing things used on this album. It was all done live in the studio. They made a point of saying that in the booklet.
I know, because the performance is absolutely insane here. Even though the self-title did use some pitch shifting and everything, it did it well, it was tasteful. But here, Glenn is a fucking machine here.
Yeah, he wanted to show like, oh no, I can do this without all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a certain element of gym culture that the band brought into this album, but not to show off, look at me. It's just like, let's kind of use all that kind of strength and power to really make this album hit hard.
Oh yeah, this album is pure masculine testosterone. There's no question about it.
Yeah, definitely. There's nothing more. I don't, there's a lot more we can say about this, but I think this is us for now.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
I've had a great time. Again, I'm glad to be back, and hope looking forward to the next time I come back for future videos.
Yeah. So, if anyone has stayed on, to this point, I think the next one will probably be Immolation. Which album? Not quite sure, because all the first five are really good.
Yeah, I know what I'm thinking of. I don't know what you're thinking of, but I
Ooh,
know what I'm.
I'm stuck between two. So we'll definitely. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Cheers.